Once in a blue moon, Taplines listener. You know the phrase, you know what it means, and you probably even know that it's the inspiration for the name of the Belgian-style wheat beer that Coors Brewing Company debuted in the mid-90s called, of course, Blue Moon. But you may not know that the mere existence of that brand, which by some metrics is the best-selling craft beer brand of all time, was the subject of debate within the company for the first few years after its release, as executives up to and including Pete Coors himself wondered whether the proverbial juice was worth the squeeze of this Valencia orange-garnished microbrew. According to Keith Villa, the brewer who created Blue Moon in 1995 in Colorado, it was anything but smooth sailing for the now iconic beer at its outset. And the call was then coming from inside the house. Villa joined Taplines last week for part one of this two-part episode about Blue Moon, and I highly encourage you to go back and check that out if you haven't yet. It should be directly behind this one in your podcast feed. That episode sets the stage for this episode, part two, in which Villa and I discuss the brand's soaring success after those rocky first few years in the Rocky Mountains, and how once Blue Moon found its footing in Coors' portfolio, it started to face criticism from outside the house, as some members of the craft brewing industry began to lambaste the beer as an interloper to the movement that its brewer had believed he was a part of. There's a lot going on in this one, listener, but what's new, you know? It's Keith Villa, it's Blue Moon, it's how Coors capitalized on the craft brewing boom, and it's all right here, right now, on Vine Pair's Taplines. Right, because as we sort of mentioned earlier, in the broader American microbrew economy, or what would become sort of the craft brewing, economy, there's that slump happening. So you've got to, it sounds like management is looking around saying, maybe this thing was more of a flash in the pan than we thought. And by the way, this Blue Moon experiment that Keith's got going on over there, it's time to wind that down. But you were I had no idea that Blue Moon was so on the ropes in its early days internally. I thought there was buy-in internally at least, but it sounds like not so.
No, not at all. It was on the ropes. I mean, I'm literally on the edge of extinction. And I remember I traveled the country as much as I could my wife, she was a saint at that time because our kids, she was at home, watching the kids, and she had a full-time job as an engineer. And so she would have to handle the kids. Luckily, her parents and my parents were in town, and so she would get help from them as I was trying to do beer dinners and get people to do this convince distributors to not drop it. Because, I would pull up sales data and say, hey, these bars in your territory are actually selling and growing. And I said, we'll keep supporting. And if I have to fly out here and do beer dinners for your retailers, I'll do it. And I did it. And I didn't have to. At that time, I didn't have to, but I did it mainly because if you remember, when I launched, I don't think I said it, but every new product that was launched at Coors would go through a process where before launch, you would present to Pete and Bill Coors and their direct leadership team. In the top of the brewery, there was this bar there. It was a bar just for the leadership. They would meet at the end of the day. And so if there was a new product, you would get there with your flip chart. In those days, it was a big flip chart. You'd have your big pens. And no PowerPoint at all. This was before PowerPoint. And so you'd have to develop, you'd write what it was you were doing, when the launch date was, when the expected return on investment would be, all these different pieces of data. And I remember presenting that and letting them taste the beer. And I remember clear as a bell, they did not like Blue Moon, the taste of it. I remember some of these senior guys, they even turned, they said, I don't like it. And they would say, give me a Coors Light, or give me a Coors Original, or whatever. It was called Original Coors, I guess. Yeah. No, Coors Original. And so they put their glasses down, and I was thinking, that's rude. And then some of them even turned their backs to me and started little conversations. And I thought, okay, And that was the impetus. That was the impetus for me saying, okay, I'm going to prove all you guys wrong. I'm going to use your money to build this thing, and it's going to be a hit. And so that was really the internal reason for sticking with my creation and making it as big as it was.
Yeah.
So because that stuck with me forever. It was even when it hit 1 million barrels, 2 million. It was I always thought back to that time, and I was thinking, ugh. So I proved him wrong in the end.
Yeah. Well, I've got this quote that I pulled from Pete Coors. He spoke with Modern Brewing Age in 1997 that I just want to frame up for you because I imagine you remember this quote maybe from your time, pounding pavement trying to get Blue Moon to catch on. So he says to Modern Brewing Age in 1997, quote, "Frankly, the specialty market, when you take out Sam Adams and Pete's, it's pretty small potatoes. It's difficult for a company our size that puts out 20 million barrels to get too excited about 50,000 or 100,000 or even 300,000 barrels of product," close quote. So, listener, that's how Pete Coors, who's the scion, the heir apparent to Bill and Joe Coors. Bill's his uncle, I think. I forget the relationship, but whatever. Pete Coors is the scion. He's taken over the reins, and it gives you a sense for just what, Keith, you were up against, even internally. You kind of got a long enough leash to be able to go develop this product, and it was getting some excitement in the marketplace, but it was uphill battle out selling the beers. You're doing a lot of hand selling, whatever, but you also, it sounds like, based on that quote and based on what you've just described to us, you just weren't getting the backing that you needed to, or the credibility or the respect that you needed to from inside the organization either.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. It was really tough. It was like pushing a boulder uphill. It was really, really, really hard because, and at the same time, we had, I had, and Blue Moon had support, more or less, from the Brewers Association. It wasn't until Blue Moon really started taking off that the Brewers Association developed this attitude of,
interesting.
That's big brewer craft. Because before that, I would go up to Boulder and have lunch with Charlie or Nancy, take them out to lunch and talk about the industry and stuff. But then we reached this point in the early 2000s when Blue Moon was just taking off like a rocket ship, and there were some very vocal voices on the BA board who said, "Wait a minute, that's not a real craft beer or a real microbrewed beer." And so that's when this attitude started forming about, okay, what is a real craft beer? And so they put together criteria saying, okay, well, it's this many barrels, independent, and this. But then, of course, it was pegged with the thought of being small. And as Sam Adams grew, they had to change that criteria. And they'd say, oh, but it's this many barrels. And then after that, it's this many.
Right. Sort of, listener, for those of you who are not as maybe inside the industry, or who don't necessarily know some of the lore, some of the backstory, what Keith is referring to is a sort of infamous, basically a joke at this point, and people all kind of roll their eyes about it and whatever. But whenever Boston Beer Company, which owns Sam Adams and of course now owns everything, Twisted Tea, owns Dogfish Head, owns Angry Orchard, et cetera, whenever Sam Adams would grow to that upper ceiling of whatever limit the Brewers Association had defined craft brewers as, well, guess what? Next year, that upper limit just happened to float upwards just a smidge more, just another 1 million barrels or so more to give Boston Beer Company, which to its credit was growing very well and obviously having a lot of success at that point. But Jim Koch was a major advocate for the craft brewing industry, and so it behooved the Brewers Association, who counted on not only his influence and his charisma, but also on Boston Beer Company's dues. They behooved them to make sure that they stayed within the lines of what was technically considered a craft beer according to the Brewers Association.
By a volume. And then when Sam Adams came out with the Trulies and Twisted Teas, the non-malt beers, then, because for the longest time the BA rules said it's got to be traditionally brewed, no adjuncts or anything. Right. But then they said, okay, you can use adjunct. So it's almost like if you were playing a game of football and your favorite team is trying to march down the field, and then all of a sudden in the middle of the game they say, rule change. It's 20 yards for a first down.
Yeah. Well, I want to talk about that for sort of this dynamic that emerges, Keith, because I think this is really germane to the story. Obviously, Blue Moon has a tremendous amount of success. It does find its footing, as we've discussed. It goes on to be the first million barrel craft beer brand, if you define it not as the Brewers Association does, but you define it in like the Potter Stewart know it when you see it type definition. I mean, I think for most American drinkers, this, they would characterize this as a craft beer. A tremendously successful beer is the long and the short of it. And as I said, earlier on in our conversation, it's a gateway beer for millions and millions of American drinkers who may stick with Blue Moon or may move on to other more other full flavored beers, across the craft beer landscape, to IPAs, to pale ales, to whatever whatever else they're into. I think on balance, in my analysis, I've only covered you've been in this business for more than 30 years. I've only covered it, for about a dozen, but in my analysis, like it has a important role, a central role in sort of the American craft brewing pantheon. A lot of people, as you alluded to, don't feel that way, and didn't. I get the sense that this sentiment has somewhat subsided. We're recording this in late 2023. This feels like kind of a water under the bridge maybe at this point for a lot of people in the industry, because frankly the beer category has bigger fish to fry than these internecine squabbles. But this was a heated point of contention, in certainly in the aughts and in the early decade that followed the 2010s. There was a lot of conversation about crafty beers, or phantom craft, you would hear some people refer to. Tom Acetelli, who wrote The Audacity of Hops, would refer to it as phantom craft beers. That, sort of had the premise here is that they had the look and feel of what the American drinker understood as craft, right? They were full flavored, they had cool labels, they had interesting names, some of these early markers of what craft meant to people, or microbrew meant to people. But they were made by big companies, right? They were made by, and you were working for Coors at the time. Anheuser-Busch, I think, was much more notorious in this pursuit than Coors ever was, based on my reporting understanding. But there was this anxiety, right, that like the big brewers were going to swoop in and trick American drinkers into drinking something they thought was craft but wasn't. And that's, we spoke a moment ago about sort of how this tension emerges, or how like the idea of a definition of what craft is, sort of starts to harden or starts to solidify. When in your memory does that start to happen, Keith?
It was approximately the mid 2000s is when it started to solidify, because prior to that, I would always head up the GABF participation for Coors, and so I would go and talk to the people at Brewers Association, because it literally is up the highway from Coors, and we would be a sponsor back then. We would provide actual cash, because there are other big sponsors, like Anheuser-Busch provided the refrigerated storage. Miller provided a bunch of the wrist tags and all these IDs saying that people were over 21. Coors would provide upfront cash that was sorely needed back then, because the GABF, it's almost a bell-shaped curve. GABF at the beginning, not many people went, but then it reached this extreme popularity where everybody wanted to go, and tickets sold out within, a few minutes after being available. And then it kind of, I would say it hasn't gone down, but it's come down a bit from its heyday.
Yeah. Sure.
And in those early days of it, I headed up Coors participation, and we would give it was a check, 30,000, I think, a year, something like that. And they needed that money because they're a nonprofit, and they needed that cash up front to pay for security, secure the venue, all that stuff. And when times were thin, I remember that I got pushback from Coors. They would say, we're not sponsoring this anymore. There's no return on our investment. Where's the return? And so I'd go up to the BA and I'd say, I'm under pressure. This is going to dry up. It's been fun, but I can't do this unless we can show some return on investment. And so I would talk to Nancy Johnson. She was the director. I think now she's VP, but back then she was the director of the GABF. And so I said, we got to show the return. So she put together, one year she put together this thick book that said, okay, here's what we can give them. And it showed how many people were there, what the demographic breakdown was. It didn't say exactly what, that this resulted in a return on investment. But what I did is I convinced the folks at Coors. I said, look, here's a little document that they made up. It shows that, at that time, I don't know, maybe it was probably 20,000 people total. So we had 40,000 eyeballs on beers. And I said, and we can have our end caps over there to really showcase our brands. And I said, it's like a commercial. And I said, we can get this done. And actually, I said, and Nancy had even gone through some work to say, here's an estimate of the amount of dollars this would be if it were a commercial. And so I presented all that, and they said, okay, we can fund for another year. And we did that for a couple of years. And then, but that was through the lean times. And then GABF, it caught on fire to the point where home brewers and all these people into beer started saying, wow, I want to go to that thing, because it's like going to Mecca for brewers. You go and you can have your favorite beers, and it grew. And so the BA, they no longer, we still provided funding, but they were getting funding from some of the bigger crafts that were starting to get big, Boston Beer, et cetera. And then they reached the point in the mid 2000s where that's when that us versus them mentality started to take hold. And they said, well, that's not a real craft. Maybe Blue Moon shouldn't be in the GABF because it's part of this and that. And I remember it was just, I was thinking, wait a minute, what changed between now and just a couple of years back when I'd come up and we'd have lunch? And it was a change. And it turned out it was basically the membership. There were some real vocal people. I won't name any of them, but there were some vocal people on the BA board who were really anti big brewer, they would call it. And they said, no, those people, they're bad for craft because they steal our share and everything. Meanwhile, they wouldn't listen, because some of these people, I would say, wait a minute, I was just in the marketplace, and there were bigger craft brewers ahead of you presenting their case to the distributor, and they just talked about how you small guys shouldn't be there because you're not paying for your retail space on that shelf. And so it was like everybody does that. It's like a war zone when you're on the sales side. On the brewer's side, it's like it's collegial. It's like if you need a cup of malt, a bag of malt, you can go get a bag of malt from your neighbor, and it's more friendly. But I think the sales aspect really turned back then and started to solidify in the 2000s, so that by the early teens, it was definitely there where they started putting the rules together. What is craft? What's not craft? And it just kept kind of doing that. And then eventually we got to today's market where, people say, if it's perceived as craft, it is craft. And we have Anheuser-Busch InBev selling off 8 of their craft brands. Right. Coors closing down, they closed down Crispin, that cidery.
Correct.
So there's just so much movement now, and it's so the term craft is, I don't know, it's had its heyday, and it doesn't mean as much as it did. I'm not sure what to think of it.
I want to interrogate, if you'll indulge us, Keith. I want to lay out sort of what the objections were as you understood them, because this idea that craft has a certain specific thing, and hey, Blue Moon isn't it, right? It animates a lot of the discourse in craft brewing for more than half a decade. I mean, it is front and center on the minds of many industry leaders in what would become a very lucrative segment for a time last decade. 12% or share of the overall beer industry, I think, is where it peaks out. But this idea, and as you mentioned, and I agree with this, I sort of flicked at this earlier, I think it's really not front of mind for drinkers anymore, or even industry people anymore, who are have bigger, problems, alligators that are closer to the boat, so to speak. But, what were as you understood them, sort of the objections or the reasons that some of those more vocal objectors or agitators within the Brewers Association wanted to carve out something like a Blue Moon or like a Shock Top, which Anheuser-Busch introduces in 2006 to try to fight what had then become a very successful Blue Moon brand? What were, besides like personal beef, which I'm sure there was some of, what were the more sort of like concrete objections as you understood them?
Well, some of them were sales and shelf space and especially tap handles. I think tap handles were really big because when Blue Moon would go into a new market, we would tell people, okay, here's our brand, here's our tap handle if you want to put it on tap. And they'd say, well, we only have so many taps. Because in those days, we did reach a point where bars had, tens of tap handles, 30, 40, 50, 100 tap handles. But prior to that time, most bars would have 4 or 5 tap handles. Some had 3.
And one was Bud Light, one was Miller Lite, or one was Budweiser. So there were really only 2 up for grabs. Yeah.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
That's the way it was. And so that was prime real estate, because back then that's how you built a brand. Whether it was a big brewer brand or a small craft brand, you built a brand on premise. Mm-hmm. It was almost impossible to build one off premise. So you would go to a bar, you had that tap handle, you would serve your beer, and so it became kind of the war zone for sales for beer. And I think that's where it kind of originated. And of course, as a brand like Blue Moon, we'd go in and we would present numbers. We'd say, if we put this on tap and you do the orange garnish and everything, here's how your sales will look. And then they'll go like this. And here's how much money you can make on that one tap handle. And by the way, it'll bring in drinkers who are coming with their friends, because the bulk of their friends might want that Bud Light on tap, but there's going to be 1 or 2 that want a specialty beer, and this is easy to drink, And if you want to really give them something stronger, you can have bottles of that down in your fridge.
Right.
And most retailers would say, "I get it. Okay, I'll do that." And I think that type of an argument would rub a lot of the smaller guys the wrong way, because they would say, "Hey, wait a minute, this is my city. I should have something on tap right there." But at that time, and maybe it was fair, maybe it was not fair, but at that time, that was reality. It was the reality. Retailers want to make money to stay in business.
Yep.
And so they would choose that, but they would typically put bottles of others down in the fridge. Obviously, it's not as prime as
you don't
having
get the
your
great
own tap
placement.
handle.
Yeah, you don't get the handle, which basically, of course, as everyone who's listening to this surely has been in a bar and knows this, the tap handle is effectively an advertisement. I mean, it is, it's the pitch to the drinker. It's eye-catching when you walk in. The tap tower is right there. So, yeah, they get bumped down to, the fridge, which may be a low boy beneath the bar, so you may have to kind of look over the bartender's shoulder to try to see what labels they've got. It's not as primo a placement. You can understand why, whether it's Blue Moon or another brand, as you mentioned, this is just hand-to-hand combat to try to get and hold those tap handles. Because it was the best real estate.
Yeah, it's like trench warfare, and you're fighting for that tap handle. As long as you can keep it, it's like it showcases your brand.
Yeah.
And there have been numerous articles written over the years, and I have kept almost all of them, that talk about Blue Moon and how it is the brand that disrupted the beer industry and brought the typical light beer drinker into craft. And I can't tell you the number of craft brewers who have written me emails over the years to say thank you for creating Blue Moon, because it was my entry into craft, and then I became a brewer. And so yeah, it really was a critical brand to change the market out there and get people thinking that beer can be more than a light lager. And but it worked. It took time. It took a lot of work, and it may never have happened if I had given up those first few years when I was getting pushback from my senior management. But I stuck with it, and then along the way, just tried to really push craft, the message of craft through Blue Moon, because it really had a voice, and up to a certain point. But then that voice was kind of shut down by the us versus them movement. And but in the end, I think everybody saw that craft beer really did grow. It became 12% of the market. The BA, they had this goal years ago. They said 20
by 20, 20% by 20. Yeah. Yep.
They wanted 20% of the beer market by 2020. And of course, that never happened. It peaked out at about 12. And because, it's due to a number of factors. But in the end, whether I hate to say it, but it's all about money. Retailers need to make money to stay in business. Craft brewers need to make money to stay in business. I mean, now we're seeing craft brewers go out under because the pandemic hit them hard, and there's some that just never recovered. Mm-hmm. People never went back to their brew pubs, and it's like, or their tap houses, and so it's all about money. They need money to stay in. It's the lifeblood of business. And if you can make money, you'll stay in business. If you can't, I mean, even look at Boston Beer. They took a huge hit because hard seltzer sales. They thought, it would keep going like that for forever. And all of a sudden, there was that huge slowdown, and they had to write off millions of dollars.
Yep.
And they still haven't recovered. They're truly still declining, and I hope they recover, but it's business.
They are thanking their lucky stars that Twisted Tea, which has been around for 25 years and has been a sleeping giant that they never, passed any real marketing budget to, just all of a sudden out of the clear blue sky came on like a juggernaut just a few years ago. And if not for that, Boston Beer Company, the joke is, and they may not take too kindly to this, but I'm sure they talk about it internally. It's not really a beer company. It, like all the bigs, including Molson Coors, which Coors would eventually, become, by the time you had left the company in 2017, it was Molson Coors. They're beverage companies now. They're diversified. Once you become a certain size, and I've reported on this in the past, you must diversify to hedge against those market fluctuations, to hedge against those overestimates or whatever. The drinker wants hard tea. Well, we need a brand that can deliver, and whether or not that's traditional craft, like, who gives a shit, man? Like, we got to sell beer quarter over quarter, it shows up on a beer truck. It goes in a beer cooler. We can fight about whether or not it's beer, in front of the TTB or in front of the IRS. But right now we need to get money in the door. So a lot of this sort of navel gazing about, sort of what the industry is and what the definition of these things is has fallen by the wayside as the urgency, as you mentioned, in the industry has ramped up over the course of the past half decade or so. Keith, we're at, over and over. You've treated us to a real trip down memory lane, and we thank you for it. I know our listeners out there, our Taplines audience, had a blast listening to you sort of reprise Blue Moon's, unsteady and then stupendous rise over the course of the late 90s and the aughts. But I wanted to close on just, we talked about sort of, its place in the craft beer landscape and in the pantheon where I believe it belongs, and I think I'm not alone in feeling like that. I wanted to close on something, a little bit more personal for you. You created this brand, or you were on the team that created it, and you came up with the recipe, you developed this, you go out, you push it, like anyone does when they've got a young craft beer brand, whether or not you're backed by Coors at that point was less relevant, because it sounds like the Coors management wasn't necessarily backing you too hard anyway. So you've gone through the trials and tribulations that are familiar to many small brewers then and now. And yet, as we mentioned, Blue Moon does have, came in for a lot of ire from some quarters of the industry at about a decade ago. Because it came from, big beer, quote unquote, because it was corporate. But you never changed. Keith Villa was the same dude who studied in Brussels, who got a taste for, wit beers there and decided to come over, back to the US and try his hand at what an American version of that would look like. How do you sort of feel about where Blue Moon's place in, the landscape, where would you situate it? I said the Pantheon, but I know there are probably some complicated feelings about how it was received by not only the American drinking public, but also your peers in the brewing industry. You've had a chance to, you've been gone 6 years now. You had a tremendous run at Coors. Now you're at Saria, but you've had a chance to sort of be removed from it. How do you think about Blue Moon's legacy?
Well, it's interesting because here in the office of our new brewery, my wife dug up a lot of this. I saved a ton of the old articles and all that stuff and advertising. And so she framed a bunch of different things. And as I walk around and look at some of these things, I see like Ad Age, all these Forbes. I see a bunch of articles from over the years where they talk about Blue Moon. And I think, wow, it really did move the needle for the craft beer industry. Yes, craft beer was always there since 1965 when Fritz Maytag, purchased the old Anchor Brewery, and that was kind of the first, I guess, wave of craft. So it's been there, but it was always this little niche, tiny, almost hard to measure from a sales perspective compared to the sales of Bud, Coors, Miller, and Blue Moon really ushered in, I think, the modern era where you can have a beverage that the drinker can drink, even if they're a Coors Light drinker, a Bud Light drinker, whatever. They can drink a Blue Moon and say, "Wow, I like craft." And like you said earlier, some people would stick with it, or find others along that same gateway status, like a Fat Tire or something like that.
Sure.
Sam Adams Boston Lager. Whereas others went further in and said, "You know what? I'm going to try that IPA or that Imperial Stout." And it's like some people would dip their toes in and say, "Oh, too much," and they'd come back. Others would say, "Ooh, I love that." And so it really, Blue Moon helped to usher in that and I would say they sped up the evolution of craft, because it really, as I read some of these articles and look around at these pictures, it really is clear that Blue Moon sped up the evolution of what craft became, and helped influence brewers, craft brewers, who actually went on to do their work, indirectly or directly. Because from a direct perspective, I helped several craft brewers when they were having issues. Boulevard, in the early days when John McDonald ran it, they would have quality problems with diacetyl or whatever. And if I happened to be in the market, I'd stop by and I'd say, "Okay, here's what's going on?" And I'd say, "Okay, here's what you could probably do to fix it." And they even had these little houses in the back, and they said, "Okay, you could stay in that if you want." And I'd say, "Okay, I'll spend the night in one of your little," they called them casitas. Those have been torn down and replaced with huge warehouses now filled with tanks. New Belgium, Jeff Liebisch, at that time, he was brewing in his basement, and I would, he needed yeast. I remember tasting his beer the first time, saying, "This tastes infected." And he said, "I don't have any way to clean up the yeast." I said, "Well, I can use my lab and propagate yeast for you." He said, "Can you?" And I said, "Sure." And so he would come to my house about every 3 or 4 months to get a fresh little culture of yeast. Because in those days, at the beginning of New Belgium, he would use yeast from I think it was the red bottles of Chimay, and he would brew with that.
Really?
So I'd culture that, and then eventually he got I don't know which strain it was, but the Chico strain, I think, and so I cultured that, and he would come and pick up his container of yeast, and then I helped him to get his first brewmaster and second brewmaster. So Peter Buchart, who was there for 18 years, I think, as their brewmaster, a Belgian from Rodenbach Brewery. I wrote one of the letters. Jeff wrote a letter. I wrote a letter to the Immigration and Naturalization Service to bring Peter over and get a green card. To this day, I still have a copy of that letter that helped bring Peter in to get New Belgium going. So I've helped a lot of craft brewers directly, indirectly, through them just tasting Blue Moon and saying, "Wow, that's great," and becoming brewers. So Blue Moon really has moved the needle in the terms of the craft beer world. And it's been fun to be part of it. But like I said at the very beginning of this, I'm never satisfied staying still. I always like to keep tasting and improving things, and and I always have time to help fellow brewers. To a certain degree, because there's some who say, "Oh, well, what about this? What about this? What about this?" And but if I'm having a beer someplace, I'll if I taste something off, I'll say, there's a little issue here, and I try to be as diplomatic as possible. I never say pour it out and go, blah, this is terrible.
Well, that's very gracious of you, Keith. Keith, I know you brought a couple props today, and if you give us just a few more moments of your time, I'm sure our viewers who are watching this on VinePair's YouTube channel would love to see them. What do you got for us today?
Sure, yeah. So at the beginning of Blue Moon, we didn't know whether to call it, I mentioned that in our talk, whether to call it, we knew we were going to call it Blue Moon, but the senior managers wanted to call it Canyon Rock Brewing Company.
There's that Canyon Rock label,
the very first prototype bottle that was made. It was never put on sale, but we said, is this going to work? And it's like, no, we got to change that. And so that was one there. And then, of course, Blue Moon came out with the first nationally available pumpkin beer in 1995. And this is the very first one here, very first bottle. And Buffalo Bills, Hayward, California, their brew pub came up with the first recreation of pumpkin beer in the modern era of craft brewing. And that's what inspired me to create this in 1995. And this was the first nationally available pumpkin beer in the U.S. And it peaked at, 45,000 barrels a year, something like that. You can look in the databases everywhere. But it was a huge brand and still continues to be a huge seasonal brand because it's brewed to have a first sip likability.
But you had to fight for it. At first, you had to fight for it. Yeah, that's right. That's what you were saying, yeah.
Sales got way down and I was under pressure to kill it off. Here's a product we came out with 2011 to 2013. They're the wine beer hybrids. I actually did these in 1996 and nobody liked them. Because they said, no, that tastes like wine.
Yeah.
It's like, well, that's the purpose. I want to make a wine beer hybrid that tastes like wine. And so when I started coming out with these, I showcased them at the GABF in the mid-2000s, and they started winning medals. And my whole goal was to make something that tasted like wine, but was actually beer. So 51% of this is wheat. 49% of the fermentables are Chardonnay grapes. And you get a really nice sparkling Chardonnay taste out of this. And I know some other craft brewers had tasted these prototypes at the GABF and they said, I got to go make a wine beer hybrid. And of course, theirs were very bitter, tasted like beer with a hint of wine. Mine were always wine with a hint of beer. And these, of course, it's a wine bottle that was tinted brown and we pulled them eventually because it caused confusion. People didn't know if it was wine or if it was beer. So and then of course when we launched internationally, I launched it in a bunch of different countries, but Japan was one of them. And we had our label for Japan, the launch, and sales wouldn't take off. So we talked to the local salespeople, and they said, "Well, you need a ritual." And so we said, "Well, let's develop something." And so they helped us and they developed this little thing. It looks almost like a skateboard park, but it's a roller. And what the ritual was on the back in Japanese, there were four steps. First, it says to set the bottle gently down and roll it to resuspend the yeast. And it always says natural. The yeast is natural. And then step 2, it says stand it up, open it gently. And step 3, it says to pour it in your glass at a 45-degree angle. And step 4, it says garnish with an orange and enjoy. And once we did this ritual, sales took off in Japan, which is crazy. And the very first
this is my favorite here.
Marketing campaign for Blue Moon was Moon Me. Jim Sabia and I, we came up with this and thought, this is really cool. Moon Me, it's the perfect bar call. You go to a bar, say, Moon Me. And of course, this did not work. And in those days, we heard from our managers that Pete had come back from a conference. He was going through the airport. And of course, we had put a massive banner at the airport in those days saying, Moon Me, enjoy a blue moon. Pete saw that and said, get that down. That's he was offended, and it was in those days. We wanted to be cutting edge, and he said, "Get it down." So that was the end of our Moon Me campaign.
Oh man!
Then we of course had our radio ads that we did. I kept the little cassette tape. These are our 60-second radio ads that we did back in those days. This is 1996.
96, yeah.
Yeah, and so on these, I would say different things and talked about my PhD in one, and we introduced a beer called Abbey Ale, and so we had the monks, the chanting monks thing, Gregorian chant. We called it Beergorian chant, and so yeah, we just had lots of stuff. But let's see, and then last thing we did was I used to do extreme beers before there was a name for extreme beers in the 90s, 95, 96, and then we decided to dig up some of those old recipes and launch them. So here's one example. We did this for a couple of years, didn't really last, but we called it the Graffiti Collection because Blue Moon was artsy and everything. We said, okay, this is like cutting edge artsy graffiti. And this is one called Chimp. It was short for Cherry Imperial Ale. And so it was an Imperial Cherry Ale. And funny part is how we came up with the name was I would write up the recipes and get everything together and take it down to the Sandlot. And the brewers at the Sandlot, John and Tom, they'd look and they'd say, Cherry Imperial Ale. They would say, this is Chimp. and the funniest story there is for Christmas one year, I did a winter brew, and I called it. I took this recipe and I combined it with the pumpkin beer, made it this Imperial Pumpkin, and I had them put frankincense in it. So it was Frankincense Imperial Pumpkin Ale, and it was a really nice beer. And so they shortened it to Frank the Former Pimp, and so it was. So they have a way of marketing things with politically incorrect terminology.
Sure, which was very much a part of that era of craft brewing too. I mean, there were all these very goofy names. We had Burkhard Bilger, listener. We had the journalist from the New Yorker on for a previous episode about extreme beer. We discussed his article that ran in 2008 in the New Yorker about extreme beer, where he focused on Sam Calagione at Dogfish Head and sort of his creative foil Garrett Oliver at Brooklyn Brewing, who was not into extreme beers nearly so much. But Burkhard Bilger's favorite goofy name from that era was Old Leg Humper, which I always thought was a classic of the genre. But that's a story for another time. I encourage you to go listen to that episode if you're interested, listener, and I encourage you to go check out Bill Owen's episode of Taplines, where we talk about his creation of pumpkin beer, which inspired Keith Villa to go on and create Blue Moon's pumpkin varietal that would be the first nationally distributed pumpkin beer. But for now, Keith, thank you so much for joining us. We've had a blast on Taplines. We've talked about every aspect of Blue Moon's creation and survival, and then, of course, its thriving once it finally found its footing, once it got that iconic Valencia orange wheel and that iconic 23-ounce Hefeweizen style, German style glassware. And, this was just a monumental effort, for you and the team that was pushing this beer. Thank you for telling us this story, man. This was an incredible episode.
Oh, it's been my pleasure, Dave. Yeah, it's fun to relive it because it's when you do it at the time, you're not thinking much. You're just thinking, I created this. It's got to keep going. We can't give up. Failure is not an option. To quote who was it, the Eminem? Failure is not an option. So he has a little more color around it. But anyway, that was my philosophy, and I just kept pushing and pushing and pushing, and it took off, and it's fun because it's part of the whole craft beer family, and whether you like it or not, it's perceived as craft. Therefore, in my opinion, it is, and it was a lot of fun talking with you, reliving the old days, and cheers to everything you do to get the word out about craft beer and its history. You're too kind, but this Taplines host will always take compliments from his wonderful guests. Keith Villa, thank you again so much for joining us. Have a great day, man. Cheers. All right, listener, that was part 2 of our 2-part episode about Blue Moon with Keith Villa. There's so much more to this story, so if you haven't yet, definitely go back and check out part 1, which should be directly prior to this one in your podcast feed. Taplines is recorded in Richmond, Virginia, and produced by yours truly and Darby Seaside, who, along with the talented Shane Farrick, composed our delightful soundtrack. Just listen to it. I also want to give a quick shout out to the entire VinePair team.
and especially co-founders Adam Teeter and Josh Mallon, editor-in-chief Joanna Sciarrino, managing editor Tim McCurdy, and art director Danielle Grinberg, who designed our lovely Taplines logo. And of course, a big thank you to you, yes, you listener, for spending time with us week in and week out. We literally couldn't do this without you. I'm Dave Infante, and I'll catch you next time.